It is common among anarcho-capitalist libertarians to say we're against the government, but that's not exactly true. I'm Anarcho-Cap, and this is a Flyover Fly-by. In episode 4 of the Flyover Libertarian podcast, entitled Anarchy is a Scary Word, Rural Rothbard and I talked about libertarian anarchy. The concept that, based on the libertarian principles of self-ownership, private property, and non-aggression, that we oppose the state. But we also drew a distinction in that between state and government. When discussing the concept of government, I use the analogy of it's like a knife. There's nothing inherently good or bad with a knife. It depends on what you're using it for. What is it being used to do? Is it being used for cooking? Is it being used for some kind of a carpentry project? Is it being used for, any number of positive things? Or is it being used to murder someone? In the same way, government is essentially the use of force. And I am not necessarily against the use of force. So that means that while the state is a government, government is not necessarily a state. So, for instance, it is government to kill or repel someone invading your house. It is government to kick someone out of your business. It is government to enforce the rules for a Facebook group. Government is the use of force, and there are obviously legitimate uses of force, and there are illegitimate. I don't know that anyone would say that I do not have the right to repel an invader coming into my home. I don't know of anyone who would claim that I don't have the right to kick someone out of my place of business. I know some people get a little edgy in Facebook groups, and so when you try and enforce rules there, be like, hey, is this a libertarian Facebook group? Yes, it is, which means that when you joined, you voluntarily submitted to the rules of the group, and it is completely legitimate for the administrators of that group to censor you if you are speaking or acting out of line with a group, and if it's really bad, to kick you out. These are legitimate uses of force, and this is government. And so the question is, but will there be institutions of government in what we lovingly call Anarcho-capitalist, in a libertarian society? When the state is gone, will there still be institutions of force? And I think so. Now, it's not as clear what it will look like, but there will be voluntary governments. Some of them will be like the ones I've already named, your church or the place of business that you attend, or that your own household, or even if you band together with other households to form some sort of a housing co-op. There will be governments that set up rules, including but not limited to the non-aggression principle, and people will voluntarily submit to those governments, and in their voluntarily submitting to them, if they break the rules, they will be in some ways punished. Now, there's 100 ways that may look, and we really can't say definitively what that would look like, because it'll probably depend on the voluntary community and the voluntary government being submitted to. But there will be people who rise above other people and are viewed as leaders and even potentially governors. Recently, in a podcast in episode 6, Getting Right with Isaac, we talked about how libertarians should be okay with hierarchies. There was a group I was a part of where we were a group of pastors and religious professionals who would get together to discuss things. Now, there was one man in particular that whenever he walked in the room, every chair would face toward him. We were all waiting to hear what this guy had to say. No one forced them to do that. No one forced them to look at this person, but it was clear that this person was what we might call an elite in the group, based on his wisdom, based on whatever. There was a view that this person had a right and even authority to speak. No government enforced that right. No rules declared that right, except for the rules within the group that we all agreed to sort of naturally. But we viewed this man as being a wise person who deserved respect, and we gave it to them. So some governments will look like that. Other governments may look more like churches or clubs, where you will join them because you appreciate the already set in place rules. In this other example, there were no set in place rules. We just all view this man as wise. But in this case, in churches and clubs, there are rules in place. There are statements of faith and covenants that you have to take in order to be part of it. Or in clubs, there are rules. This club exists to do this, and we're going to do it in this way. And if you don't follow those rules, the elected officers or hired leaders will have the right to remove you. And if necessary, they might use force. There might also be governments that look more like insurance agencies, which is how some people have theorized it will look. That there will be like these insurance companies that you would hire to oversee defense of your property, to oversee enforcement of rules on your private highways, who will do any number of things like that, that will exist to prevent theft, to bring to justice those who break the rules, and things like that. And it may be that we will voluntarily submit to those insurance agencies in the sense of paying into them on the grounds that we will follow whatever rules they have. Maybe like a health insurance agency that won't insure you if you smoke cigarettes. They have that right. And in that case, there's not so much a use of force, but there may just be a removal of services. But if these agencies type governments exist, maybe they will be used to say bring justice when someone's property is stolen. And it will be imperative on them to be better than a state, because if they're not a good company, people won't do business with them. But all that's to say, in this libertarian world that we picture, there will be government. But we live in a real world. We live in a world not of theory, a world where the rubber must meet the road. And so how does this libertarian view of government, help us to understand and view the state as it exists? This is actually the first of a few flybys that I'm going to be using to sort of expand on this concept. But ultimately, what this means is we shouldn't oppose the state doing legitimate things, even while we oppose their existence as a monopoly of force. Let's put it like this. In the perfect world, if a government, we're not happy with the way it's working, we could set up a competing government within that same area. But the state claims monopoly of force over a given territory and does not allow us to set up competing governments in the areas in which it claims a monopoly. So, where they claim a monopoly of force, we should expect them to do it. When there is no other option than to call the police for help when someone robs you, we should call the police. At the same time that we advocate a better world, we need to live in this world. And that means when the state does what is legitimate for a government to do, we should not only not oppose that, but we should support it. I often bring up this article I read once on the Libertarian Institute, where the writer tells of a scenario in which he was almost run over while going through the crosswalk, and he saw a policeman pull that car over. And the question he asked is, was I a bad libertarian because I was happy about that? The answer is absolutely not. In the anarcho-capitalist libertarian society, there will be the enforcement of rules. There will be rules on the road, and they will be enforced. And so, while we live in a world where the state has a monopoly claim on that work, we should support that. We should be okay with that. With caution, certainly. Even while we say that while the police exist, they should protect life and property, we also should acknowledge that they don't always. That they do enforce illegitimate rules. While we acknowledge that some rules will exist on highways and roads in the libertarian society, We can also acknowledge that some of the rules are arbitrary under the state, and we should certainly oppose those things. And we should always be cautious, even as we support the state doing its legitimate things, knowing that often the state will take a legitimate operation and use it to do something illegitimate. But the truth is, we live in a real world where we live under a state. And libertarians should certainly, in the midst of that, cry out to the world, there's a better way. But we also have to have a second line of reasoning in order to deal with what actually is. I'm Io Ancap, and this has been a Flyover Fly-by.